Okay. Alrighty. So, what to do? All right, what are we talking about today? All right, so we are finishing talking about religion, youth and religion today. So a little bit more on some stuff from National Study of Youth and Religion and all of that jazz. In terms of your midterms, I didn't have a chance to look at them yet. I was finishing marking for another course, and I should have those, I hope, completed tomorrow, if I get a good pace going, and nothing interferes with my plans, which almost never happens. But assuming that everything goes to plan, I should have them done either tomorrow or Friday, and so then we can we can start. And I'll just post the grades as I go. So I'll start from the back of the alphabet this time and work my way to the front. So the marks, you might see them coming up over the next couple of days. What's the tea of the day? This is Country Peach Passion. I don't know. Again, it's just a random tea. I haven't even tasted it yet. So my tea of the day is Country Peach Passion, brought to you by Celestial Seasonings. Buy them online. Use code Dr. No, I'm kidding. I wish I could be sponsored by Big T. That would be super helpful. Okay, so very quickly, and hopefully people have had a chance to, because only 6 people were here, and then only 8 people were watching online. So hopefully people have had a chance to sort of catch up with where we are. If not, right, last time, really an hour and a half, we talked about youth and religion a little bit, right? So kind of laid the groundwork in terms of what the landscape looks like. And broadly, right, from sort of millennials, Gen Z, and forward, we're less religiously engaged, more young people identifying as nuns, right? Nothing in particular, no religion. Then in previous generations, that's been the really big jump, is the jump in nothing in particular, and a reduction mostly in people identifying as Protestant. We talked about the first of our kind of concepts of how youth interact with religion, which was moralistic therapeutic deism, right? So that's from Christian Smith and Melinda Lundquist Denton. And then, sort of looked at life outcomes, teen religiosity and life outcomes, looking at levels of religious devotion rather than particular religious groups, and sort of noting that amongst those who are the most religiously devoted, they also tended to have, reasonably, and across most measures, better life outcomes than those who are not religious. And largely, Smith and Denton put it down to these 9 cultural factors, right, which I won't go over again. So you can go back and look at the video. But again, as I said, it was kind of these two that are almost certainly, unique to religion. Maybe this one. But the rest of them are all really sort of things that you find in communities, and especially non-age stratified, relatively stable community settings that young people attend for long periods of time and therefore form a lot of social bonds, right? So, it's not necessarily here even the religion that we think is probably leading to the better social outcomes. It's the level of social integration with these kind of long-term communities. Okay. Country Peach Passion. All right. So, hang on. Let me go back to my title page. So there's a follow-up to this, right? And actually, there's a few, but we'll just go through the next quickest one because it's the one that's most applicable when we think about youth and religion. And that is basically a kind of follow-up work, because this is a longitudinal study, right, that went from 2002 all the way, or 2001 all the way to 2015, and they revisited the same group of people, right? So that same 3,000 people, they attempted to resurvey them. I believe they found about 2,600-ish of them again, and that same group of 300 people that they had interviewed, I think they got about 300 or 276 of them and were able to re-interview them a few years later. And at this point, right, you're now talking about people who are largely 18 to 25. And so, it's interesting to kind of look at, as people go from adolescence, right, from being teenagers and largely under the care of their parents, what happens to them as they move forward into emerging adulthood. Okay, so they split the sample down the same kind of lines, but what you see, right, and this is pretty typical of what happens in the transition from adolescence to emerging adulthood, the religiosity sort of downshifts, right? So the devoted, in that original sample, right, the people they classified as devoted made up about 8% of the sample. In 2005, it's down to about 5%. The regulars, right, so regular religious attenders, down to 14%, a little over 14% from about a quarter of the sample in that first wave. The sporadics, up a little bit by 0.9, so they were 17, now they're roughly 18%. And the disengaged up a ton, right? It's what you see generally, a big downshift, right? Way fewer people up in the more kind of regular practicing religious part of the sample. And that's largely what we expect, right? There's typically as people transition out of parental homes where there's that enforcement of religious norms by parents and move into emerging adulthood, move away for school, or parents just start to treat them more as adults and let them make their own religious choices. Usually that happens around between 16 and 18. What you see is, generally speaking, less religiosity amongst young people. And that's exactly what we see here. Okay. Now, that said, what we see generally is that the pattern, from that first wave is more or less consistent across a whole bunch of social metrics. It looked like that most religious part of the sample, right, that 5% that was the devoted, had kind of consistently more positive and more pro-social outcomes than the less religious cohort, right? And you kind of see it here, so most of them, across the board are still in contact with their mothers and their fathers, right? So generally speaking. But in terms of closeness of parental relationships, the devoted scored considerably higher, right? I guess getting along with their mothers, talking to their mothers about personal subjects very often, feeling their mother understands them very much, right? And that's a pretty solid gap across the board, between 15 and 24 kind of points difference here, right? Not as close to dads, I guess. Harder to stay close to dads, but again, a meaningful difference if we look at, relationships with fathers, still much better for those who are the devoted. And that probably comes down to sort of a stronger emphasis in religious communities on a kind of family values and that sort of thing, right? So the more devoted you are, the more likely you are to be in that kind of space. And they were less likely to have, seen their parents break up. 76% of them, it was no parental breakups, the highest number in the sample, and the lowest for, seeing parental breakups 2 or more times. So, generally speaking, it looks like the quality of parental relationships was better the more religious you were, right? Okay. Social engagement, so the number of activities, right? So what kind of groups and social activities they're engaged in. Not huge differences here, but still meaningful. 2.4 organized activities that they're part of in this kind of emerging adult period. A little bit higher than our regulars and sporadics, and quite a bit higher than the disengaged, right? Double the disengaged. And it's largely this, right? So on average, they take part in 1.1 activities sponsored by a religious organization, and the other groups basically don't at all, right? So they're more engaged in community life, largely because they participate in a normal amount of kind of, you might say, secular activities, right on par with everybody else, but add then a sort of religious activity on top of that. And there you go. That's the difference. And these numbers are so old now that it's hard to make heads or tails of them. But at the time, they were less likely to be on social media and less likely to be visiting a social networking website once a day. So there's that. Okay. Same story with risk behaviors, right? Drinking alcohol, weekly or more, less often, a few times a year or never, right? Considerably more. And I think the one that's probably more kind of, if you want to talk about health, frequency of binge drinking was considerably lower than these other groups. Binge drinking being a particularly nasty way of consuming alcohol, consuming a lot of it all at once, pretty bad for you from a health perspective, right? I'm more likely to say they never binge drink. I don't know if that would hold today. Like largely, I understand, Gen Z doesn't drink because drinking is expensive. Everyone's broke now. So, that's actually a thing, right? Liquor sales are way down and the industry's like, oh no, what are we going to do? Young people don't drink anymore. And it's like, yeah, when you go to a bar and, one beer costs $8.50, I wonder why. I don't drink anymore either for exactly the same reason. Okay. Fewer of their 5 closest friends who do drugs, right? The percentage, fewer of them, and again, the disengaged way, at 50%, that's considerably higher. They smoke less, smoke less cigarettes, less marijuana in general. Haven't been in as many fights, although, still have been in a serious fight more than one, 12% have still been in a serious fight more than once in the last 2 years. And, less likely to want to take risks, right? And this is a pretty consistent finding with religious people. People who are highly religious are far more risk averse than people who are irreligious. Okay. Hey. That's disappointing. But sorry, I drank, for people not here, I drank a sip of my tea, and the flavor is really underwhelming. Yeah. My mother-in-law would describe it as quiet, which is, I've always found is a weird definition or a weird way to describe a flavor. I would say mild, but yeah, it's way too mild for me. Quiet is a weird one. Okay. So, physical health, right? Well-being. The devoted, more likely to rate their health as very good or excellent. More likely to be in, a normal BMI range, right? Less likely, only by a little bit here, right? We're only talking about 2 points or 6 points, right? So not huge, but less likely to be overweight, and less likely to be obese, right? Then 2 of these categories, the sporadics, maybe the sporadics spend all that sporadic time running, I don't know, or at the gym, or maxing out protein, who knows? That's probably a more recent thing. Okay. More likely to say that they are somewhat happy, right? And that's a pretty significant gap, right? Between all of these categories. So they're more likely to say they're happy. Again, there might be some social desirability bias in there. Less likely to say they're somewhat or very unhappy. Not huge gaps with these two categories. Definitely a reasonable one with that one at 12%. Planning for the future, again, a little bit more likely than some of the other categories. And, somewhat less likely to say that they seldom or never plan for the future, or rarely or never plan for the future. And more likely to think about the meaning of life, which is maybe just a religious thing, but interesting anyway. Right? Rarely or never feel sad or depressed, a little bit higher, 10% higher than the religiously disengaged. Less likely to feel that life is meaningless, right? 4 times less. They feel more, what's that one? Oh, rarely or never, right? More likely. They feel more loved and accepted by a significant margin. Again, consistent with those teen numbers. They seem like they feel alone or misunderstood less than others, and so on. Less likely to feel invisible. And again, those guilt numbers. Often they feel guilty about things in life. And here, we've kind of had a reverse. They feel a little bit more guilty than some of these other categories. So that's a more expected number. And less often they say rarely or never. And, traumatic events about as likely. So it's not just that they've lived sheltered lives. So that's fun. Okay, and I think this is my last one. Yes. Sorry, I know charts are super fun. Across the board here, right, in terms of feeling that life is close to ideal, feeling that conditions of life are excellent, satisfied with personal life, gotten the important things out of life, and their average life satisfaction score, all of these look better than all of these, right? So they look like they are, happier, more well-adjusted in general than their less religious peers, right? Because these are still, these two are at least still somewhat religious. Okay, so the really quick takeaway from this, and I promise no more charts for the moment. There are kind of obvious ways, that our religiously devoted young people are different than other emerging adults, right? Less risk-taking, less risky behaviors, better health, happier, and so it looks like, religion in some ways, and probably through a lot of those community mechanisms, closer family bonds, and all of that is helping them transition into emerging adulthood a little bit more easily than some of their less religious peers. And again, this is an interesting finding, though I'll note here, and this is me, not Smith and Denton or Smith and Snell. It's interesting, right? Clearly, religion does something for people, right? It's useful. It has a social purpose. And that social purpose, for those who still engage in it at fairly high levels, still seems to work pretty well. The fact is, though, fewer people are engaging in it, right? I mean, if we go back a couple of slides, all right, I guess I don't need to go back. It's only really that 5% of the emerging adults in this big, statistically representative sample that would really be in the devoted. So for them, tra-la-la, life is great. For the other 95%, right, really difficult to recommend anything, right? I say a doctor can't prescribe religiosity as a cure for what ails you, right? If you're depressed, going to a religious institution might be a good idea, but religion generally is something either you feel or you don't, right? And it's pretty hard to make yourself believe in religious beliefs. And a large part of why people show up to religious services on a weekly basis is because they share the beliefs of the people there. And yeah, so, well, it's interesting. It's a little unclear how this might help, other than to note that, one of the things that religious young people seem to have that others, to some extent, seem to lack is a sense of community, right? And that community seems to be really, really important in terms of that transition into emerging adulthood. And again, we'll talk about that some more as we go through. Okay. I'm going to check. I know this, I can't remember how many slides this is. It's not very many. I said not very many. I lied. We'll go through this pretty quickly. All right. So that's millennials, right? That's what the millennials look like when they were basically, in these two samples between the ages of 13 and about 25, right? That was what their religious lives looked like. And again, dominated, at least in Smith and Denton's and Smith and Snell's sort of sense, by a religion, that they call moralistic therapeutic deism. So we're going to talk now very briefly about Gen Z and religion and sort of the, ultimately what how Gen Z is maybe a little bit different from millennials, right? Because, if we think of millennials, right, millennials are growing up in the beginning of that internet era, right? A lot of people put that decline in religiosity down to the internet, right? And suddenly the plurality of ideas that are available. Gen Z is a little different. Gen Z is born into that world of kind of pluralism and endless access to information, and also into a world where, how to put this, identity, I say that a lot, I'm sorry. I know how to put it. It's just a stall for me to think for a second about what I'm going to say. Where, identity is really largely, in a lot of ways, choice. And you select identities from a menu of available choices that you can customize very much to your own desires. Okay. So, again, we saw this at the beginning of this unit, right? Maybe I'll show you that slide from the beginning. This is all Gen Z, right? Gen Z pretty consistently, I should fix that, that's 24%. Pretty consistently, right? About a little over half of them identify as Christian, and about a quarter-ish of them identify as no religion, right? And that's been pretty consistent. And I think one of the things that I noted, and I'll jump back to that other slide, is a big increase from past generations in terms of the number of people who identify, amongst those who identify as Christian, who identify as just Christian, right? And here I think what's important about this is just Christian largely is a sort of, deinstitutionalized religion, right? They've taken whatever they think faith or Christianity is about, and they've said it's not, I'm not going to put an institutional label on it. And in a lot of cases, right, when it comes to like our, especially what's Protestant, right, most of them who call themselves just Christian are probably largely from traditions that come out of Protestantism. But for whatever reason, the churches or the religious bodies or the information they're getting largely doesn't identify them as Protestant any longer. So they've had a sort of separation from a notion of Christianity along these kinds of institutional or denominational lines of Catholic and Protestant, right? Now it's like just Christian. So they're either not part of institutions, or the institutions they're part of have largely split from these very strict identifications. There's also going to be a cohort of just Christian that isn't affiliated and probably doesn't attend religious services at all, but still considers themselves Christian, and it's just kind of a very, very loose identity. Okay, so I say Gen Z, very different attitude to religion and spirituality than past generations, and like I said, they're very deeply disconnected institutionally, right? So far, and we'll get to this when we talk about how they construct faith and their religious identities. It's very, very different. But you get statements like this, right? Oh yeah, of the young people who identified as very religious, less than half told us they found connecting with their faith community helpful during challenging or difficult times, right? So largely outside of institutions, though they still might consider themselves very religious. 58% of young people in general said they don't like being told answers about faith and religion. They'd rather discover things on their own. We'll see that stat again in a sec. And, a little bit suspicious of, half of them a little bit suspicious of religious communities because they think they're just trying to fix their problems and give them easy answers. Okay. Whole bunch here. Right. So these are a bunch of different statements and asking people's level of agreement with them, right? So percentage of young people who agreed with each statement. And here, if I remember the kind of base data, they've sort of merged, strongly agree and agree into one category, which people do quite a bit, to present data in a simpler fashion. But you can kind of see the trend here. I think you can see those okay. Maybe I'll zoom in. Zooming is fun. A recently discovered technology. Okay, right, so what do you have? So 60%, right, agreed or strongly agreed with the statement. They don't believe some of the things they hear talked about at religious gatherings. Almost 60% said they don't like being told answers. We saw that already. Then the question was asked, why, when facing uncertain and difficult times, do you not participate in religious practices or turn to religious communities? They find other things that help them find meaning in their lives. About half of them, right? A little bit more than half say they don't feel like they can be their whole selves in religious communities. I think that's an important statement. Religious communities try to fix their problems, right? Again, a little bit more than half. Religion, faith, or religious leaders try to give them answers, but they're looking for something else, maybe emotional support or closeness. Religious communities are rigid, restrictive, and that's not helpful. Young people seem to hate restrictive things. Half of them say they just don't know where to find a religious community. Half of them say they have other communities. They don't need a faith community. That's why they don't reach out. This is a select all that apply thing as well. So you're reading each of these statements. Religious gatherings focus on topics that make them uncomfortable. Religions are about certainty, don't welcome asking questions, right? A little bit less than half. And down the list, right? They don't trust religious leaders or religion, faith, or religious leaders in those kinds of institutions. They don't think religious leaders will care about their problems. They don't feel safe in faith institutions, right? They didn't grow up religious, about 42%. About two-fifths say they've been harmed by religion, faith, or a religious leader in the past. And that's a pretty ambiguous statement. I don't love that one. I think here Gen Z will often construe harm in emotional ways, not physical ones. So I think, obviously when I see this, I'm like, oh, is that sexual abuse? But I don't think it's two-fifths of the young people who answered this poll said they'd been, abused in some way. It's a lot of like emotional harm going on here. And yeah, they would not even think about it because, it's not something they've ever gone to before. Okay. So young people also perceive, in this poll at least, a big values gap. Now this is a weird chart. I'll explain it really quickly. I have my pen? I do. Okay. So the top line, right, the top green line is the percentage of young people who said they care about something, right? So that's I care is the light green. The dark green is they think their communities also care about that thing. So their religious communities also care about that thing. And then the orange is the gap between the two things, right? So basically, this isn't to say that, 44% of religious communities care about LGBTQ rights. It's just that 44% of the young people who took this said they thought those communities cared about it, right? But you see that they perceive a big values gap between what they care about and what they think the religious communities around them care about, right? And it's, so on LGBT rights, 27%, a quarter, or, I guess that's not a quarter. It's a 25% gap in their perception of what their communities care about in terms of gender equality, 23% in terms of immigration rights, income inequality, 22% for disability rights, environmental causes, a 21% gap, reproductive rights, a 21% gap, right? 75% of them say they care, but only 54% of them think that religious communities care about the same thing. Racial justice, right? 81% of them said they cared. Only 60% of them thought the religious communities around them cared about it. Black Lives Matter, right? That was a smaller gap. And apparently gun reform was the smallest gap there, which I find surprising because the way that especially American religion has merged into kind of Republican Second Amendment gun-loving culture, I think is not unsubstantial. But, it is that is what is in this poll anyway. Okay. Now, hang on. No questions. Perfect. Okay, so this is kind of similar data to what I just showed you from the National Study of Youth and Religion, with one kind of caveat. I think this is, how to put this? this is way less robust, right? The way that Smith and Denton and then Smith and Snell asked the questions was to basically ask about a whole bunch of outcomes in fairly objective ways, right? Like how often do you smoke? How often do you binge drink? How good is your relationship with your parents? This one is more like so you basically asked a question is like, oh, would you say that in your romantic relationships you're flourishing a lot, flourishing a little, not flourishing? What I don't know exactly the categories they use. I'd have to go back and dig into their data a little bit, but it's kind of self-perceived flourishing, right? So how much are you flourishing in these spaces? Now, I think that's a way less robust way to ask this question, and to talk about who has potentially good life outcomes. That said, and the other thing is, in the reporting they did here with their visualization, they didn't break out. So they have the very religious and the not religious at all. They didn't break out any middle categories, right? So we don't know when it comes to somewhat religious where somewhat religious is based on this data. And they have published the raw data. I just haven't had a chance in the last, I think they published it about a year ago, and I haven't had a chance to go through and kind of look at it. That said, what we see here is largely sort of what we found in the national study of youth and religion, right? Largely in a bunch of different kind of categories, the very religious, at least on the surface, feel like they're flourishing a lot across pretty much every metric, right? So, about a little over a third feel they're flourishing a lot in romantic relationships, right? It's a 14% more than the not at all religious. In friendships, it's about half, or a 15% gap. Family relationships, right? 40%, a 20% gap, a 25% gap in relationships with trusted adults. More on that in a little bit. That's a really important number. At work, right? A 20% gap. At home, a 20% gap, right? And this is the only one in majority territory. But, we have a few that are kind of near majority. So 51% of the very religious thought they were flourishing at home. In finances, right? So again, we're talking in this poll, they're polling 13 to 25-year-olds. So up at the top end of this, there are going to be financial kind of questions. Physical health, again, not a majority, but still a 22% gap. And the smallest gap was in, social and online life, a 15% gap. And that's one of the lower numbers, but still, right? And in their mental health, right? So in their own kind of sense of how they're doing, the very religious, again, seem like they're doing a little bit better than the non-religious in this sample. Okay. All right. I think I got 2 slides left on religion, and then we will jump to something else. So out of this information, right? So taking all of this stuff together, the report's author, a guy named Josh Packard, he's the founder of Springtide Institute. Really cool guy. Got a chance to meet him a couple of times. Really, really nice, really smart. Love the work he was doing at Springtide. He's now moved on to something else. But, I thought really interesting work when he was there. They've gotten a little bit less interesting since then, though not much. Okay. And he comes up with this term to describe how young people construct their religious identities, or what Gen Z religious identities look like. And he calls this faith unbundled, right? Which has the unfortunate, acronym, which I get all the time when students don't want to write faith unbundled in their, in their responses. It's FU, which is super funny. If I've ever felt insulted during an exam, people start off with FU is a concept that means, okay. Anyway, faith unbundled. Okay, so the way Packard explains this is he says, largely, I think, and we can see the technology model of generations here a little bit too, that the way young people now construct their religious identities is quite similar to how they construct their listening habits, or their on something like Spotify or Apple Music, or does anyone use Amazon Music? I don't know, probably not. Right? Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music, if you just love really terrible interfaces and want to struggle with it forever. I have YouTube Premium because I can't stand watching ads, and I should not also pay for Spotify, but I hate the interface on YouTube Music enough that it's worth my time. Anyway, so what is Spotify like, right? Or your Netflix viewing habits? They're very customized, right? Like the reason that something like, Spotify Unwrapped is really popular and why people love looking at theirs and seeing other people's is because they're all very unique, right? Everybody kind of puts together their listening habits in very unique ways, taking little bits from different genres, different artists that just sort of suit their personality at a particular moment in time, right? And what Packard says is that this is largely similar to what young people do religiously, right? So here, let me highlight. So faith unbundled is a term that describes the way young people increasingly construct their faith by combining elements such as belief, identity, practices, and community from a variety of religious and non-religious sources rather than receiving all these things from a single intact system or tradition. So, and today's youth no longer, let's highlight in a different color because it's fun, rely on a single institution to make sense of their identity, engage in community, outline the boundaries of belief. I think that one's really important, right? It's a belief, or offer practices that mark significant moments in life. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, I think, if you consider how maybe a contrast between what Packard is saying about Gen Z and what we can kind of reconstruct about older generations, is that largely, right, if you were someone who was part of the silent generation, you would probably have constructed, the boundaries of your belief largely based on the institutional context that your belief was formed in, right? So if you were Catholic, right, you would largely adopt Catholic beliefs, right? If you were, part of the United Church, you would largely have those beliefs, right? If you were Muslim, right, you would have, depending on the brand of Islam that you're part of, right, you would largely construct your beliefs around that. But young people today don't seem to be doing that, right? According to Packard, it's not like, even a young person who's Catholic is just going to take the whole package of Catholicism and say, yeah, that's me. They're going to sort of mix and match, right? So he says, right, religion's not a closed system, but an open system that flows out of other systems such as science, ecology, socialization, politics. That is, religion flows through relationships. One of the things that I loved, and I got a chance to see a presentation that Josh Packard did and chat with him about it, which is really cool on this particular topic. And I really liked what he said, because what he said, and maybe I'll go to the next slide to talk about this. So what is it? Uh-oh. Okay, I'm hoping that was a pocket dial. It's one of my friends, one of who only calls me when bad stuff happens. Every time I see the phone ring and he's calling me, I'm never optimistic. Pocket dial. Okay, it's perfect. Oh, thanks. Last time he called me, his sister was in the hospital in a coma, and I'm like, that was about 2 weeks ago, and I haven't heard back since. So, oh no, she died. No, I think we're fine. Okay. She's been sick for a long time. That's okay. All right. So, what does it mean to unbundle belief from a single system? Okay. So he says, it looks like, highlighter time. It looks like young people who turn to many or various sources. Oops, that's an eraser. I can already tell I did that wrong. When making decisions. So, many or. That did not work out. Okay. Eraser. Okay. Would a yellow highlighter work better? Yeah, various sources when making meaning or discerning what to believe about right and wrong, purpose, meaning, solitude, all that stuff, right? It looks like curiosity. I love the thing that he said here, because he said his expectation, and largely, Josh is Catholic, And so I think largely this expectation is sort of conditioned by that Catholicism. Is he said what he expected young people to do was, either they were going to be, praying the rosary. And if you don't know what the rosary is, right, it's a Catholic prayer. You pray it with sort of a series of beads, right? A series of prayers that you pray. It's a very traditional Catholic practice. And he expected, that young people would do something like, pray the rosary, or use tarot cards, or crystals, or whatever it happens to be. And what he said is, and what really surprised him, in the statistical data they got and the interview data, is that largely Gen Z doesn't seem to approach it that way. It's less of a either or and more of a both and, right? So lots of young people would say pray the rosary and use tarot cards if they found both of those practices useful and meaningful, right? Gen Z seems really open to grabbing a bunch of different religious practices from a bunch of different sources as long as they work for them, right? So if you want to connect this a little bit to MTD, it's very instrumental in its approach to religion, right? Rather than sort of taking the whole bundle and being like, okay, I'm Catholic, so we're going to pray the rosary, we're going to go to confession, we're going to, keep high holy days, we're going to do all of those things, right? It's like, okay, I'm Catholic, so I'm going to pray the rosary, but I also think tarot is pretty cool, so I'm going to do that. And I have some Reiki crystals and my Buddha statue in my bedroom, right? And all of these different things. Why? Because they're useful, right? And they're going to try out a lot of practices, right? And a lot of things. They're going to essentially try a bunch of different stuff and stay with the things that work, right? So if it's like centering meditation from Buddhism and yoga and a Christian practice, right, that's what it's going to look like. Okay, so that, he says, is curiosity. What does it look like to unbundle identity from a single source, right? So again, actually, I'll let Josh speak for himself. He says it better than me, and I'll just try to explain. So they're unwilling to shed part of themselves to fit into pre-prescribed narratives about who and how to be in the world, right? And he says it looks like a commitment to wholeness. So, I mean, if you've ever heard, and this language kind of floats around in Gen Z spaces, right, that you want to be your authentic self, right? That's wholeness, right? And what he's saying is that, in the past, if you're picking up sort of a religious system from an institution, what you largely would have done is sort of adopt that identity and sort of try to either minimize or cut out those parts of yourself that don't fit, right? But increasingly what he says is that young people are Gen Z's unwilling to do that, right? So they're not going to adopt wholesale a religious ideology. They're going to use one that allows them to kind of, be their authentic selves or bring their whole selves to any particular space, right? So again, a very different approach to religion. It's not you trying to fit yourself into religion. It's trying to fit religion into yourself, in a sense. That's an awkward way of putting it, but I just did it, so there you go. Okay. So they've unbundled community from a single source or system, right? So again, largely it's deinstitutionalized. So if they find community in a place that works for them, that's where they're going to be, right? So young people show up where trusted personal relationships exist or new ones seem possible. And young people are willing to forego participation in communities lacking these qualities, even if they had long-term associations with these communities, right? So they go where they think good relationships are possible, and they're not where they don't think that's the case. Okay. And here's the practice part, right? It looks like young people who blend and adapt various rituals, behaviors to suit and make sense of their current questions. So it's a flexible religion, right? So again, it's, bundling together whatever works for you in terms of religious practice. And it largely seems to be the Gen Z approach to religion, not a single framework, not sort of solid identities based in historical institutions, but sort of shifting sand, right? And going where they think, relationships are possible and putting together practices that work for them, right? And so the presence of that just Christian category makes a lot of sense when you see this because, right, they're not likely to be like, I'm going to fit myself into these pre-existing labels like Lutheran or Presbyterian or Anglican or Catholic. They're going to be, I have this core belief in, say, Christianity, but then the stuff surrounding that is very unique and very customized. Okay. Have I heard the Ritual for Heretics? Heard about the Rituals for Heretics book. What are your thoughts as it relates to unbundling? Not familiar with that, actually. I think I've heard the title of the book. I have not had a chance to read it, so I have no thoughts. But I'll look it up when I have a chance, and maybe I'll come back with thoughts. Okay. Let me, okay, discard. All right. So, how are we doing? 147. Let us talk a little bit about mental health, and then we'll take a break. As long as my stream is working. Okay, it is. Okay, so shifting gears, kind of. We're going to... Wait, the screen's no worky. That hasn't happened in a bit. Sometimes my laptop decides when I switch screens, it just is like, I'm not sharing my screen anymore. So that's good times. All right. I will have to look at that. So we're going to shift from, religion to talking about mental health. I think why I have this title like this is I used to talk about health more generally, and then I just started talking about mental health, and I never changed the title page, so I just put it in brackets. But this is largely just about mental health, which seems to be one of the bigger challenges, especially facing young people. Okay, so we're going to go from a Springtide study to another Springtide study. I really love these guys. They do really, really great work. Okay, so as part of their 2021 report on what was going on with young people, Springtide basically leaned into, was it 2021 or 2022? I can't remember. Basically started asking questions a little bit more broadly about young people and how they were doing, right? Still asking religious questions to some extent, but they also kind of ventured into mental health. And again, I think they're really interesting as a research institute because they are almost exclusively focused on young people between the ages of 13 and 25. And all of their research sort of relates. That's why I have so much Springtide stuff in my slides. Okay, so they started out this report by kind of citing a bunch of other research looking at, kind of how people are doing in American society. All right, one from Cigna in 2018. So Cigna did a poll of 20,000 US adults 18 or older. So a nice, big, super representative poll. So really high quality data. And their chief takeaway on Gen Z was that Gen Z, they said, was the loneliest generation and claimed to be in worse health than older generations, right? Including people, kind of into middle age, where chronic health conditions really start to kind of bite into people. Okay. And what Cigna said is, social media alone was not a predictor of loneliness, but they were pretty lonely. Heavy social media users and those who never use social media had a similar score. Now, this is probably largely related to the fact that because Gen Z is pretty technology heavy, and most people use there are really heavy users and kind of moderate users and low users, but more people in that moderate to heavy category, it affects the cohort overall, right? So basically, you can't get away from the effects of a technology just because you decide not to use it, right? If you're like my mother-in-law and you refuse to use a computer, that doesn't mean you don't live in a world where computers are sort of dominant, right? That technology still is really, really central to the world, and you're still going to feel the social effects of that technology. Okay. Springtide also cited this national research done by Ford Motor Company, right? So the car company, and a lot of big companies like Ford do market research, right, to figure out what their consumers are like so they can better market to them. And Ford is no different. So they did a national survey in 2020. And basically it identified loneliness as one of the most pressing issues confronting society. And I'm always a little jealous because the person who is kind of reporting and coordinates the research at Ford has, I think, the coolest title of any person I've ever heard. They are the chief futurologist for Ford Motor Company. And I don't know why, but I'm like, but I want to be the chief futurologist of something. That sounds really cool and kind of amazing. So I want that job, or at least I want that job title, because it sounds really cool. So Ford's chief futurologist said, amongst other things, trust in institutions and brands is declining, right? And our examination of loneliness suggests that many people feel they lack trusting relationships with peers too. And without the bedrock of trust, people feel increased anxiety, right? So trust in brands and institutions was declining. And this is kind of across the board, all over institutional life. But also, trusting relationships with peers was declining as well. This is the 2019 survey they did. So they must have reported this in 2020 or 2021. I can't remember. Slightly smaller sample than some of their later stuff, right? I think one of their later ones in 2025 had 2977. They're a little bit better funded today than they were then, but they had 1,000 surveys of young people between 13 and 25, so still representative sample, though a little bit smaller, and 35 qualitative interviews. And they tried to measure Gen Z's kind of belonging or loneliness using a really well-validated statistical tool called the UCLA Loneliness Index. Okay, so what did they find using... My friend then sent me a follow-up text message. Sorry, how are you, guy? And I'm like, okay, I'll answer that later. I'm like, is the follow-up message important? It is not. Okay. It's not my sister's dead. Okay, I'm good. So many had so what did we find? Many had high rates of loneliness, social isolation, and stress. Okay, so that I think is important. We'll look at those numbers in a sec. The other, that chair is really creaky. One of the things, I think this is super interesting, because sometimes what you find when you're doing like qualitative research is you as a researcher think you've composed a question that makes perfect sense. And when you go to pose it to your participants, you realize that their social situation is so different that they fundamentally don't understand what the hell you're talking about. And I always find this interesting, right? Because we see this in the National Study of Youth and Religion when Smith and Denton and their research team try to get people to talk about morality, and they ask them like what they think about objective morality, and they're like, yeah, some percentage of our participants didn't understand what we were talking about when we talked about objective morality. That idea didn't make sense to them. And what the Springtide folks said was that Gen Z struggled in the quantitative portion to note where they felt belonging, suggesting that the question didn't really make sense to them because belonging wasn't a question of where, it was a question of who, right? Or whom. With whom do they feel belonging, right? So belonging for Gen Z seems to be a quality of people rather than of institutions, right? So do you feel like you belong at church? That doesn't make as much sense as, do you belong with the people who are there, right? So it's more of a question of what people they feel like they belong to. Okay. All right, and I'm really sorry about the graphics here. That year, they did not release a nice PDF copy. They only released a print copy, so I had to, take pictures of the graphs, which, when you get to this one, it's very awkward because it's on 2 pages, but that's okay. I love their data viz guys. They do a great job. All right, so in terms of loneliness, about a third of the young people in the sample, right, reported feeling completely alone much of the time, right? So, that's this number here, completely alone. They had this split, right, because they're interested in religion, between total sample and those who attend religious gatherings. And just attending religious gatherings didn't seem to make a difference here. And again, what I'll note is I don't think that's the most useful way to look at this kind of data. religious intensity seems to be more of an interesting way for me to think about it, but whatever. That's neither here nor there. All right, so almost 2/5, right? So almost 40% said that they felt like they had no one to talk to overall. Just shy of half said they feel that no one understands them. A third of them, solidly said they feel like nobody knows them really well. And, again, about 2/5 said they find it difficult to make friends. And that's across the sample. Okay, so a lot of them showed strong markers of social isolation, right? Which is the state of having little or no social contact or experience of belonging in societal organizations or groups. And here is what this kind of looked like. So this is the percentage of 12 to 25-year-olds who agree, responding always or sometimes to each statement, right? So almost 1 in 10 of them said that they feel like they have no one to talk to always. About a third of them said they feel like they have no one to talk to sometimes, for a total, in the kind of less good results of, again, almost 2/5. About 2/5 of them say they feel left out, 12% always, 27% sometimes. 7% said they always feel their relationships are superficial, and a quarter of them said they sometimes feel that way. So again, lacking deep connections. People are around me but not with me. I think so that's 1 in 10 who said always, and then another 24%, who said sometimes. This is a phenomenon that social scientists have been talking about for a while. Sherry Turkle, who's a human technology interaction researcher at MIT, has written a bunch of books together. I think the most important one here is a book called Alone Together, in which she talked about this kind of at the beginning of the smartphone era, right? When did she write this? About 2012, right? So just when smartphones were really sort of entering majority territory in terms of ownership, that increasingly what she saw on college campuses and in kind of high school situations that she was in was young people who were, she said they were kind of alone together, right? They would be together in spaces, but because so many of them were on devices, right, engaged in kind of using their smartphones, they weren't really present in the spaces, right? So they could all be gathered together, but each of them sort of felt a little bit alone even when they were with friends, right? And I think that's largely what's reflected here. People are around them but not with them, right? Because people are distracted all the time. And this applies to parents as well. And they feel isolated from others, right? So 1 in 10 said it was always they felt isolated from others. And about a quarter said sometimes, right? Again, so for a total of about a third. Okay. All right, so these ranges are a bit big for my liking, especially this one. I would love to see this broken down a little bit further, but this is the way they presented the data, so this is what we get. Okay. Meaningful interactions. So about 2/3 of young people, bless you, 13 to 25, it's allergy season, man. Oh, I feel ya. About 2/3 of young people said they had 3 or fewer meaningful interactions per day. Right, so that's, the bulk of that, I guess about 1 in 10, right, are saying they have 0 meaningful interactions in a day. So that's a very isolated, I would suspect very sad and lonely 10% of our 13 to 25-year-olds. But then a huge percentage of, our 13 to 25-year-olds, now you're going to make me sneeze, 57% said that they had 1 to 3 meaningful interactions. I am going to sneeze. Okay, I'm going to fight it. We can do this. With another fifth, right, 19% having 4 to 5, so that's a better number. And then 5 or plus meaningful interactions, about 14% saying that, right? So A huge percent having very few meaningful interactions in a day, again, would suggest that they're pretty isolated and lonely. And yeah, for nearly 40%, right, feel no one at times, oops, that should have an S, at times no one knows them. And feeling known, right, as we kind of established at the beginning, is a key part of Gen Z feeling like they belong, right? Why do they show up? And this follows nicely on the kind of Gen Z religion slides, right? They're willing to show up where relationships are possible because feeling known is really important to them rather than just belonging in an abstract or ideological sense. Okay, how am I doing for time here? Oh, it's only 2 o'clock. Man, I'm burning through slides. It's great. I'm a cherry Coke Zero. It's awesome. Okay. All right. Now, other things. Stress, loneliness, and anxiety. What Springtide says, about half of young people in the survey experience what they said are multiple stress factors, right? So there's a whole bunch of things here, but basically what we see, 58%, right? So almost 60% said they feel stressed or overwhelmed overall. So they agree or strongly agree with that. 2/3 said they feel like they don't have enough time to get everything done, right? Pretty normal experience, I think, of probably especially college and university life. A lot of demands, hard to fit everything in. 60% feel fatigued even when they wake up after adequate sleep. Doesn't get better, trust me. And 56% of them said they have a hard time feeling relaxed, right? So generally speaking, looks like some struggles and stress factors. And about 1/3 of them, a little bit more than 1/3, oh, I guess this one's important too. Many participants, especially in the qualitative portion, noted that their stress and anxiety got in the way of building connections and belongingness, right? So the belongingness that they need to kind of thrive in life and to feel connected is being inhibited by the stress and anxiety that they feel, right? And again, anxiety is a really, really common Gen Z experience. Okay, and yeah, 1/3 of young people report having no one to turn to when they are stressed. Okay, now, again, sorry about the poor quality graphics here. What seems to be largely true, and without sort of, belaboring what's on these slides, I think what's pretty obvious from, most of the research is that young people largely are deinstitutionalized, right? They're less likely to take part in organized religion, political activities, social clubs, sports teams, right? They largely exist in sort of these atomized spaces, increasingly, trying to build connections online, right? And their trust in institutions is sort of at an all-time low. And you can see here, right? This is the 2019 column in terms of, institutional trust. And they pulled this from Gallup, I believe. Back in the 1970s, I guess people trusted big business about the same, but people trusted the medical system a lot more. The presidency, okay, it's 2019, so I think that's Trump time. First Trump time, 38%, right? So it's gone down considerably. TV news, right? Less. Congress, way less. Newspapers, a little bit less. Public schools, that trust is almost halved. Banks, right? That is half. And organized religion, right? People trust institutions less. And basically, when you talk to these young people in the Springtide sample, right, in terms of their trust, where 10 is complete trust and 1 is no trust at all, the only institutions that basically kind of crack, 5, so, kind of 50% trust, they're kind of in the middle, is nonprofit orgs, public schools, and banks. Why anyone would trust a bank, I don't know. But there you go. Everything else, right, organized religion, the media, presidency, and big business, all rate less than 50% in terms of trust. Okay. Did I hit my step goal? No, just other people texting me. Okay. My wife that time about our cleaning lady who didn't show up for the 3rd time in a row. I think we need a new cleaning lady. Okay. So how am I doing for time here? Oh, still so good. That only took 6 minutes. Crazy time. All right. So if you remember, right, if we went back to the religion slides, I almost should port that slide forward into this unit as well, right? One of the things I noted was that in that national study of youth and religion data, what we found with the devoted, on the whole, they had better life outcomes, right? And they were more connected to adults, right? So they had more adults that they felt they could turn to other than their parents. Their parents knew more of those adults as well, right? So they had kind of higher levels of connectedness. Now, I think what Springtide does here actually bears this out in kind of really, really interesting ways, is they suggest trusted adults decrease feelings of loneliness, isolation, and stress. And they basically, so they measured, or they asked young people how many trusted adults they had in their lives. You can kind of see, do I have it? I don't have it here. I thought I had it on a pie chart, but I don't. I have it in here. About 8% of young people said they have no trusted adults. About a quarter said they have one. 52% have 2 to 4, so that's pretty good. And only about 17%, so less than a fifth, say they have 5 or more. What you can see here, right, in this very beautiful graphic that looks like crap because I had to take a picture of it out of a book, but reveals some really interesting information, is if we take these indicators of loneliness, stress, and social isolation, right? I feel completely alone. No one understands me. I feel left out, and I feel stressed and overwhelmed. What you see is a really strong link between having fewer trusted adults and young people feeling lonelier, less understood, left out, and stressed and overwhelmed, right? So it went for those who had 0 trusted adults, 62% of them feel completely alone. 70% said no one understands them. I can't see it on my screen. 59% said they feel left out, and 72% feel stressed or overwhelmed. Add 1 trusted adult, and that drops pretty significantly, right? Feeling completely alone drops to 46%. Feeling that no one understands them drops 10% to 60%. Feeling left out drops from 7% from 59 to 52%. And feeling stressed or overwhelmed drops a solid 5%, right, to 68%. Now, an even bigger change comes when you go to 2 to 4, right? So 2 to 4 trusted adults, right? Now that number is less than half, right? Less than half feel completely alone when you go 2 to 4 adults, trusted adults. 41%, right, down from 70%, right? So basically like a 30% drop, I guess 29% drop in terms of feeling that no one understands them. 37%, from 59, 22% drop. And then 57 say, they feel left out. And 57 down from 70, is that 79? No, 73. Sorry, there's a schmut on my screen. 73%, right? So a pretty solid drop there as well. Say they feel stressed or overwhelmed. That's 2 to 4 trusted adults. For 5 plus, well, at 5 plus trusted adults, right, things are looking pretty smiley. Only 9% say they feel completely alone. Only a little bit less than a quarter say they feel like no one understands them, which is still pretty high. 21% feel left out, and 39% feel stressed or overwhelmed, right? So the more trusted adults in your life, the better kind of a lot of these mental health outcomes look. And again, not to put too fine a point on it, but when we looked at that national study of youth and religion data, right, what we saw was that the devoted, right, again, largely because of their integration into these communities, right, had more trusted adults, right? They were, or I think I didn't call them trusted adults in that sample. It was adults a young person knows well enough to talk to other than parents, right? 8.4 compared to lower numbers for all of those other groups. That's basically trusted adults, right? So again, this is a community life kind of thing. The better you're integrated into communities, the better you do in general, right? The less integrated, the worse. So if you're, looking at that other data, if you're religiously disengaged, right, you're likely to be less involved in community life, right? We see that even when we look at those emerging adults, right? They're doing on average somewhere 1.1, 1.2 fewer activities than those who are religiously engaged or devoted, right? And even when, you start moving out of being a teenager, right? So you hit 18, it's not like at 18 you no longer need adults that can mentor you and guide you. You still very much need that, and you still benefit from having trusted older adults in your life. And so, right, this kind of holds, and that better community life, that better integration into institutions, I think probably largely explains what's going on here, right? I would say, 5 or more adults, you're probably involved in some kind of institutional life, whether that's a religious organization, a club, a sports team. Did I say political party? I don't know if I said political party, but political party, right? Something, right? Some kind of organization where you're networking with older adults, you're going to have better outcomes there. And I think this is one of those, I want to say paradoxes for Gen Z. They do better when they're more connected, right? They need that relationship with people, but because they're so deinstitutionalized rather, they largely forego where you might, joining organizations where you might meet trusted adults that you can build relationships with. And this does not seem to be entirely to their benefit, right? If anything, it seems that, some percentage of them, here and here, the 8% and the 23%, so again, close to a third of them don't seem to have enough relationships with trusted adults to mitigate some of those worst feelings of loneliness and isolation. Okay. Curious about why trust in the medical system decreased so steeply. So that might, given that this was taken in 2020 or 2019, that's 2019, so that can't even be COVID. I was going to say it might be COVID. That's a really good question. I think people just trust institutions less, right? Is big pharma entirely trustworthy, right? If we put big pharma in the medical system, right? Just think of if you've ever seen those US ads. It's like, ask your doctor about this. It could cause blindness, death, dying, bleeding. Yeah, Anthony.
I'm going to ask about follow-up. In the medical system, is there as much of a drop in Canada as there is in the US? I can see it being just how expensive it is.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the insurance question. I would have to look, actually. I don't know that off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure I could find it. I would suspect that we're starting to see a strong sort of decline in trust in the Canadian medical system, mostly because, since COVID, it's exposed some of the failings of the Canadian medical system. Don't get me wrong, wouldn't want to live in America or pay half my salary for insurance or possibly lose my house if I get an ingrown toenail. But, I think it's definitely declining, though, whether it's at American levels. I'd actually have to check, and I think I might be able to find it. I will see if I can remember to look that up, but I don't know. Although I would suspect it's higher in Canada than in the US, like more trust in the medical system, if only because, you're not worried that, you might lose your house or they'll charge you $5,000 for a Tylenol in the hospital, which they definitely do. America, it's a place, right? All right. And here, right, if you want to just see the kind of difference of these numbers right next to each other, right? So this is your 0 trusted adults versus 5 trusted adults, right? And you see, the sharp declines, right, from, when you have no trusted adults to 5+, right? Much less likely to suffer from severe loneliness, right? So, all right. Okay, so how are we doing? 2:16. Wow, I'm just really burning through stuff today. That's great. That'll give us some time at the end of the course. It'll be all good. All right, so I guess let's do a couple more. How many slides do I have left in here? This is where the stuff gets really depressing. Woohoo! Because it hasn't been depressing enough so far. Okay, we'll do a few more and then we'll take a break in a minute. We'll go. Yeah, actually, you know what? I need a break right now. It's too depressing, and I've gone through like a unit and a half. All right, let's take a quick break. Let's take 20 minutes. We'll come back at 2:37. Or you know what? Let's just say 2:40. We'll come back at 2:40. We'll take a 23-minute break. And then we'll come back. We'll finish talking about mental health, and we'll start talking about what's going on with men and boys, probably today, if all goes well. And we'll kind of go from there. What's that? What a joy. I know. The class really ends with a, hey, everything sucks. All right. it's oddly loud. Just I love these desks in general. They're not awkward at all. Oh. Sometimes wish this whole building would sink into the earth when no one's here. That later. Okay. Alrighty, let's do this. Usually that one shows me the time. It's not doing it today. Okay. Alrighty. Oh, I didn't make new tea. Just gonna finish drinking this one, even though it's sad and depressing. Yep. Country peach, whatever. Not good. Okay. Any gossip? Nothing. No, nothing interesting today. I don't think. Sigh. All right. I didn't have a chance to look that up. Okay. So let's talk outside of our springtide stuff, which I think tells us some interesting things. let's talk about some broader looks at kind of mental health questions for young people. All right, so 2021, Twenge et al. Published an article in the Journal of Adolescence, and basically what it found was that adolescent mental health was declining worldwide, right? So this is not a uniquely American phenomenon. And the reason that Twenge, oops, that's an eraser, chose to highlight this is sometimes people will claim that adolescent mental health in the United States is particularly bad because of anxiety about things like violence, gun violence in schools, and those kinds of things. And so Twenge, and then like people like Zach Rausch and Jonathan Haidt, who frequently work with her, always want to stress that actually the declines in adolescent mental health are worldwide. Now, so this is 2021, and one of the things that she notes is all of this started prior to COVID, right? So the decline in mental health is not simply related to, the effects of kind of isolation, the COVID pandemic, and all of the long chain effects that brought in, but potentially has been made worse by them. Okay. Now, this is affecting both males and females, right? So men and women, boys and girls. But the effects, especially the measurable ones on mental health, have been more pronounced in females, right? Now, they theorize, and I'm pretty much there with them. If you can guess by what we've talked about so far, bless you, that the decline is likely related to generalized declines in time spent with other, fewer strong social bonds, and things like deinstitutionalization, less time spent out in the real world. Okay, so this is a few little pieces here from the CDC, right, Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, that has been conducting the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And this is data from 2011 to 2021. And basically the survey is conducted, as you see here, every 2 years, right? Okay, so nice, relatively longitudinal data. So that is super fun. What are the trends? Well, young people reporting experiencing persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness, right, has risen considerably. It was pretty stable, right, from here to here within a sort of margin of error range, jumped considerably in 2019, and then, jumped a little bit more, another 5% in 2021. Now, the 2021 number could be affected by COVID, right, that thing that we all remember, but the 2019 number certainly wouldn't. Okay, this one, less definitive, but interesting nonetheless, reporting that they experience poor mental health. This is a new question on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, right? So it wasn't asked in any of the previous waves, but in 2021, it was a hair less than 30% reporting that they were experiencing they experienced poor mental health. Seriously considered attempting suicide, and pretty stable through here. Takes a little bit of a jump in 2019 and a further jump in 2021. Made a suicide plan, which usually marks that it's gone from considering to being more serious about it. Again, pretty stable within a couple of percentages, through this period, but jumps in 2019 and then a further jump in 2021. Suicide attempts, again, this one's actually pretty stable. And I would say, they have it as a stop sign that the trend is, bad. But overall, I think this one is actually not crazy because you're really only looking at a 2 to 3% difference. And I always think that's within kind of margin of error. Were injured in an suicide attempt that had to be treated by a doctor or nurse. That one has been stable for a while. Okay, so again, this data from that same Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So Percentage of female and male students experiencing persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness increased. And you see, the increase greater, it's almost 20%, or I guess it's 21% in females versus only 8% increase for males, right? So both of them are trending upwards, but for females, it's trending up faster. Okay, percentage of male and female students seriously considering attempting suicide. And again, males, again, they have it again as an upward trend, but really only, it stayed pretty consistent, really only went up 1%. The big jump, right, and this is 11%, this is 1% increase in females over that 2011 to 2021 period, right? So again, you see the worst trend is the one for females. Okay, average, so this is data from something called the American Time Use Study, right? So again, this is a longitudinal study that's been running for, a couple of decades, just asking people how they use their time. And what do we see? Well, the average amount of daily time spent with friends has gone through some ups and downs, but it has really declined, right, really from about here. And this, 2012, this is Zach Rausch. Again, he works with Gene Twenge and Jonathan Haidt. He was their grad student. Now he's a collaborator with them. And what's kind of interesting here is that's the year where we get sort of majority of young people owning smartphones, right? Okay, so what do we see? Well, if we go back to 2003, that magic age when the younger or the older millennials were just coming into emerging adulthood, they were spending on average, somewhere in excess of 150 minutes per day with friends, right? And that number declines. 2009, right? It's declined a little bit. It's dropped down to, let's say 110 minutes with friends. So a 40-minute per day decline. Bumps back up a little bit and then really starts to tank after 2012. And by the time you hit 2019, which is here, right? So, 2020, depending on when the data was taken, and that I don't know, right? It could be COVID effect, but 2019 certainly is it. And there you're looking at 70. So, a little bit more than a 50% reduction in time spent with friends. Now, this is true of every age cohort. Every age cohort is spending less time with friends. It's just that the most substantial drop is in young people who were spending the most and are now spending still the most, but much less than before. Okay. Alrighty. There are markers. Sorry. We're going to start in the US. Then we'll look at some other jurisdictions, including Canada as well. Okay. So, serious markers of mental illness are increasing. And here, right, we have two things. Percent of U.S. undergrads diagnosed with a mental illness and U.S. anxiety prevalence, right? So this would typically be a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. And what have we seen? Well, anxiety has really spiked in our kind of youngest cohorts, right? Now, it's spiked the most in the 18 to 25 cohort, right? Like considerably. It has gone up, what did they say? 92% since 2010. And our next, kind of our older emerging adults to kind of, early 30s, it's still up about 62% since 2010. And the other ones, right, they're up. This one's up 18%, though it's still pretty low. And 50 plus, it's actually decreased since 2010. That's probably Gen Xers coming into the sample largely in that age group. And they're just a little bit more resistant to anxiety for whatever reason. All right, percent of U.S. undergrads diagnosed with a mental illness And what do we see? Essentially all of these have increased to some extent, right? Though these ones, bipolar, anorexia, substance abuse and addiction, and schizophrenia, they've all increased, but the lines are actually pretty flat overall. ADHD, has jumped pretty considerably, 72% since 2010. But the real big ones, obviously, are anxiety and depression, up, respectively. And you see the sharp, the way that line kind of goes into a steep ascent. Anxiety 134% and depression 106%. But it's the direction of the line, I think, that we should be more kind of concerned about, that it has that sharp increase. And one of the reasons is, like, if you look at historic social science data, sharp increases like that are really rare, right? Most times, when you're looking at social research, they sort of bump around and they go up and they go down and they go up and they go down and they go up and they go down, right? And there's sort of trend lines that you can draw, but these sharp upward curves, what are sometimes called hockey stick graphs, right? Because they kind of look like a hockey stick, are relatively rare. And usually they appear when there's something significant in the social environment that has changed. Okay. Oh, we're going to use our special zooming powers for this one. Okay. So, U.S. teens admitted for non-fatal, bless you, non-fatal self-harm, right? So that we got our two categories. Oh, let's start here. U.S. teens ages 10 to 14, non-fatal self-harm. We see the instances of non-fatal self-harm have increased considerably, right? So if we start with girls, there were about 150 to 160 cases per 100,000 population. By the time we hit 2020, right, and it's been rising for a while, that's up to somewhere around 450 cases per 100,000. So a big increase. Boys, age 10 to 14, far less, right? A 48% increase. But we're still talking, having gone from around 50 cases per 100,000 to probably somewhere closer to 75 cases per 100,000. So an increase, but not nearly as massive. Okay, now when we get to our older adolescents, right, the line's not quite as sharp, right? It doesn't jump quite as quickly, but we see a pretty substantial increase, right? It was about 500 cases per 100,000 population for girls, right? And by 2020, it's sitting at about, low 700s, kind of around the 700 mark. So definitely a marked increase. For boys, right, 37% increase from just over 200 per 100,000 to, a little bit more, probably 250 per 100,000, trending towards 300. Okay. Suicides. All right, I can get both of these in on the same zoomed in slide, right? We see suicides age 10 to 14, right? Still pretty low, right? So the number is not crazy in boys 10 to 14. Started sub 2, right? So like 1.8, 1.7, 1.8 per 100,000. Had dipped, by 2007 down to like 1.2-ish, and, shoots up after that. And by the time we hit, 2018, where it sort of peaks, you're looking at, 3.5-ish per 100,000 population, which in that age range is quite high for 109% increase. The increase for girls has been bigger, from around 1 to right around 2, right? 1 in 2004 to right around 2 in 2020, right? And not a big difference from 2018, where it sat around 2 as well. So it's roughly doubled, right, in this data set. And in 15 to 19-year-olds, right, boys have seen and obviously this is an older cohort, suicide is more prevalent than in younger children. Boys, right, have gone from around 12, 13 per 100,000 to, 16. I guess it kind of peaks out in about 2017 at about 17 and a half per 100,000 for boys, right? So a 34% increase. The increase percentage for girls is larger, but obviously, sitting at about 5 per 100,000, still considerably lower than it is for boys. Okay, one of the reasons, can I unzoom? No, I need to use my magic powers again. One of the reasons that suicide is a really, really interesting kind of marker when it comes to mental illness, and why it's useful as compared to even something like anxiety and depression, is largely because it's super resistant to reporting bias, right? There's some argument to be made that say things like anxiety and depression might be vulnerable to, say something like Gen Z being more willing to talk about mental health. Suicide, both, non-fatal suicide attempts, right? So this is going to be hospitalizations and suicide are very, very objective measures, right? Because they're tracked by the government, right? When a young person comes into an emergency room, typically with some kind of self-harm, it's noted, right? A record is made and it's reported to the government. It's something that's tracked very carefully in a lot of jurisdictions. Suicide as well, right? That is a statistic that is tracked by the state. So it's a very objective measure. It's not susceptible to reporting bias or changing social attitudes. And we have suicide data going back, for more than a century and a half in the United States and Canada. So we have really, really good data on it. So we can see when things change and it's pretty objective. Okay. All right. Canada. So we see similar trends, though again, published data is not quite as good in Canada. But what do we see? Can you see those okay? Why don't I zoom in? I have the power. Excuse me. So we're talking about emergency department visits. So this is Ontario, right? Just Ontario, but Ontario is big and pretty populous, so good source of data nonetheless. We see a kind of similar trend. Emergency department visits for self-harm, right? So this is visits for self-harm in Ontario for 13 to 17-year-olds. Had been on a downward trend, basically from 2004 till about 2011, at which point it jumps up, right? So since 2010, 138% increase, and it went from, in 2010, about 300 per 100,000 to, 700 per 100,000 by 2018, I think, is when this data ends. For boys, less of an increase. Again, that line looks much flatter, and it looks like it's about where it was a little higher than it was in 2004. So boys, in terms of self-harm, much more stable than girls. This one I think is super interesting. Okay, what do we see here? So we got 3 lines, right? Basically, excellent or very good mental health in Canadian women. And we've obviously got 3 different sorts of age cohorts. I think what's really interesting about this, right, is if you go back to those heady days of 2003 and all the way until basically 2012, I guess the data point is here. So 2011, the youngest part of the kind of cohort of Canadian women, your 15 to 30s in this sample, rated their mental health as very good, excellent, or very good, right? So young people were more likely to rate their mental health as excellent or very good. And then, whatever happens between 2011 and 2013, they go from, the most likely to the second most likely. And by the time we hit 2015, the youngest part of the cohort is the least likely to rate their mental health as excellent or very good. And it plunges compared to other cohorts, right? And by the time, we basically have an inversion. By the time we hit 2019, so again, before the pandemic, before any of that, the cohort that was the least likely to rate their mental health as very good or excellent, are 47 plus, are actually the ones most likely by 2019 to rate it as excellent or very good, right? So now older adults seem to be doing better than teens and younger adults, which is, again, a really weird thing. And they've only 47 plus have only seen a 2% decrease compared to 11 and 29%. And again, the sharpness of this line, of that yellow line, is really interesting. It's an upside down hockey stick, basically, of mental health getting worse for younger women. It's essentially the same story for young men, though just, it's not quite as stark, and that line doesn't drop quite as sharply. You can see, right, that for women, it's dropped really sharply in that youngest part of the cohort. For young men, the exact same pattern holds. 47 plus by 2019, the most likely to rate their mental health as very good or excellent, and 15 to 30, the least likely. With just for the 15 to 30, it's only dropped 15% as compared to 29 for their female counterparts. Okay, where are my de-zoomers? Okay, and yeah, this manifests. So younger Canadians generally seeing significant declines in self-reported mental health, and which is manifesting in more mental health related conditions, and all of the things that go along with that. Okay. The UK. So again, in case you thought this was just America, just checking how many slides I have left. Not that many. Next one is Australia, I think. Okay, so the UK. Similar kind of trends, and again, we'll zoom in on our charts here. Happiness trends, and where did this? So this comes from the Understanding Society survey. Again, one of the nice things, UK has really good data as well. What do we see, right? Okay, so basically, life score, kind of mean happiness, 0 to 10. So 0 obviously being perfect unhappiness, and 10 being perfect happiness, neither of which ever actually happens. What we see, right, at about 2009, 2010, males and females, young people, UK teens aged 10 to 15, basically each reported a happiness score of around 8.17, 8.16, right? Really statistically not a significant difference. After that point, female happiness starts to drop. Male happiness holds steady for a little bit longer and really only starts to drop after 2013, 2014, right? After which point it starts to drop as well. Basically, girls decline about double what boys declined. And again, they started at about the same point. 4% for boys, dropping to 7.92, still pretty good. And girls, 7.47, but a decline in their kind of mean happiness out of this Understanding Society survey. Anxiety and depression, kind of same story. Anxiety has risen for both boys and girls. Girls started from a higher point, and they've maintained, but boys have closed the distance a little bit. They've increased slightly more in terms of anxiety. And depression, right, boys have seen a 60% increase, whereas girls have seen a 130% increase since 2004. And then again, those are self-reported. Same story as the US in terms of UK teens 13 to 16 hospitalized for self-harm. This comes out of the Orem and Gold data sets from the Clinical Practices Research Data Link, right? So a government database. And again, what do we see? Pretty stable for both of them, and by 2011, the boys basically haven't risen. Girls have risen a little bit. And then for girls, it takes a steep jump, right, where now you're at 1,250 cases of self-harm hospitalizations per 100,000, just after, 2013 there. It settles down a little bit after that to, somewhere probably around 1,200 by 2018. So again, pre-pandemic, but big jumps. And boys, a smaller jump, right, from somewhere around 100 to 200, probably about 200, to just north of 250 in the same time period, right? So 250 per 100,000. So a big jump for both of them. So that's our UK. Okay, and again, the pattern is the same. We're seeing increases in both with a stronger female increase than male. Okay, Australia. Again, everybody reports data a little bit differently. Self-poisoning, right? And here they have it split into different cohorts, but you kind of see the trend, right? Now, I'm assuming self-poisoning in Australia as opposed to being poisoned by one of Australia's 700 poisonous animals. I assume that's why they, why they report it this way. But what do we see, right? Back in 2006, we're looking at about just a hair under 1,400 self-poisonings in teen girls 15 to 19 per 100, that's per 100,000. I believe. I'm assuming it is. Self-poisoning. Oh, no, that's just flat number of self-poisoning events. Sorry, not per 100,000. So about, in a year, hospitals are recording roughly, say, 1,400 self-poisoning events amongst girls 15 to 19, and it goes up to a little hair over 2,600 by 2016 or 2017, 2016, 2016. So again, pre-pandemic, so it gives us a good indication that something interesting is happening. And again, the sharp rise here is the really interesting part because things don't usually work this way from a social perspective. The increases for girls 5 to 14, boys 15 to 19, and boys 5 to 14 are all there, but certainly not as pronounced. The biggest jump, obviously, girls 15 to 19. Okay. Self-harm. My peripheral vision read that as self-farm, which would have been not the same thing. Self-harm hospitalizations for Australian females, right? Interestingly, right, you see a decline in self-harm hospitalizations in the 30 and above cohorts, right? They actually all decrease since 2010. And our two youngest parts of the cohort, right, 15 to 19 and 20 to 24, each recorded pretty substantial increases. Obviously, it peaked in like 2017 and came down a little bit coming towards 2020 for our 15 to 19-year-olds, but still, a general increase. Okay. Overnight psychiatric emergency department visits. Again, a very objective measure. Another thing tracked by hospitals and put into central databases, and that's out of the Australia's health snapshots. Mental health of young Australians. Okay, so again, what do we see? Youngest part of the cohort, 12 to 24-year-old females see a big increase in overnight psychiatric emergency department visits, likely related to self-harm or suicidality. Those are the most common ones, though it doesn't say here, right? So it goes from like just a hair above 500 per 100,000 to, basically about 1,000 per 100,000. So roughly doubling, right? An 81% increase since 2010, right? And an even bigger increase since 2008. For slightly older women, 25 plus, 7.7% increase, not huge. Males is up almost a fifth, right? Almost 20% for 25 plus, and a 51% increase for males 12 to 24, though it's still pretty low, and it's the lowest in that kind of data set. All right, and then psychological distress. This one's a self-report number, so definitely more vulnerable to reporting bias and changing social norms. But I think, right, you definitely see that hockey stick shape there. A 74% increase for females, 16 to 24, 55, I guess the male one came down a little bit from 2019 to 2020, a 55% increase though since 2010. And your older, still increases for older cohorts, 25 plus, but they're still far lower than their younger counterparts. So, is Australia my last country? Oh, no, yes. So Australia, right. So at least if we talk our kind of four big Anglosphere countries, right? Canada, the United States, the UK, and Australia, right? So we don't have New Zealand here, but that's okay. I suspect similar trends. What we see is generally kind of declining mental health across the board, declines across kind of objective and self-report metrics. So it looks like a general kind of decrease in well-being overall. Okay. So, am I going to get myself in trouble here? I don't know. This one's always interesting. Politics seems to play a role. generally speaking, on most measures, those who identify as politically liberal experience worse worse mental health outcomes than either moderates or conservatives, right? So this is Pew Pew Research, right? Very reputable kind of research group in the U.S. They do really good statistical research. They're nonpartisan, all that good stuff. What did they find, right? So data from the American Trends Panel, Wave 64, graphed by Jonathan Haidt here. And what do we see? Ever told you have a mental health condition? Basically, we look at it, it's about 20% of the youngest kind of conservative women, and let's say 15-ish% of the youngest conservative men report having a mental health condition. Jumps up a little bit for moderates, right? For the young, our youth part of our cohort for moderates. For women, it is about 25, let's say 27% roughly based on this chart, and for men, just shy of 20%, about 18%. When you look at liberals, right? For women, liberal women in that youngest part of the cohort, 18 to 29, is roughly half of them, a little bit more than half, say that a doctor or a healthcare provider has told them they have a mental health condition, and about a third of men. Now, obviously, as you get older, through that sample, the numbers go down, right? So that's probably a sort of reporting bias. Younger people being more likely to say, seek help or reach out on, if they feel like they're struggling on mental health questions. But the age-to-age comparison is kind of interesting because obviously political ideology either plays a role in mental well-being or in your willingness to reach out or seek medical care for a mental health condition. Okay, depression scores. Similar story. What do we see? Depression scores, and this is data from Monitoring the Future, this amazing survey we have going back, decades. So what do we have? Well, there's always, going back to 2005, there's a gap between liberals and conservatives, right? Basically, conservative males and conservative females, all the way through the sample, are the least likely to get high depression scores on the questions asked by Monitoring the Future. But female liberals and male liberals have jumped up considerably and are the most likely now to have high scores in terms of mental illness, right? Depression scores. That's not mental illness. Depression scores, right? With, female liberals having gone from about 1.9 and jumping up to about a little over 2.6. Female conservatives have jumped, and they were at just over a hair over 1.7, and now sit at around 2.2, right? Male conservatives, the lowest depression scores, and male liberals still high, but considerably lower than their female counterparts. Okay, so other fun things. Again, this is data from Monitoring the Future, graphed here by the Free Press. What do we see? Percent of U.S. 12th graders that agree with the statement, life often feels meaningless by political stance and religiosity, I would have said. I don't like religiousness as a word. Liberal, so liberal, religion, not important, right? The most likely to say that life often feels meaningless, about a third of them say that. Liberal, but religion is important, it falls to mid-20s, right? About 22%. Conservative, religion not important, still lower. I mean, it had peaked up about here. You're talking about like 16, 17%. And conservative, religion important, the least likely to say it at, around 10%, maybe a little bit sub 10%, right? So again, ideology seems to play a role in a whole bunch of things like feeling like life is meaningless, depression scores was the other one, reporting having a mental illness. So that always interesting. Okay, I'm going to zoom on things, but I'll give you the. Is this my last? Oh, I have. Wow, I thought that was my last slide, but it's not. I have so many more slides. What is even happening? This unit has gotten longer over the last years. This used to be the last slide. Okay, let's zoom. Okay, again, great data here for monitoring the future. Monitoring the future asks a bunch of questions that they basically rank in terms of a kind of score for what they call self-derogation, right? And these are the questions, right? So it's basically these 4 questions that they ask, level of agreement with, right? So I feel I don't have much to be proud of. Sometimes I think I'm no good at all. I feel I can't do anything right, and I feel that my life is not very useful. So depending on how, and this is all strongly agree to strongly disagree questions. So depending on how you answer that, they basically put together a kind of score of self-derogation, right? Okay, so what we see is if we go back to 1977, right? So this is where these longitudinal data sets are really interesting and really kind of important. Basically, liberal boys, liberal girls are roughly in the same place, right? There's not a lot of difference between them. And they kind of stay, I would say, in terms of these kind of trends, relatively tightly packed all the way until you hit about 2009, 2010, at which point everybody rises in self-derogation, but liberal girls and liberal boys rise much more quickly. And their self-derogation numbers, right? Their feelings that they're kind of worthless, rise much more quickly and to a much higher point than conservative boys and conservative girls. Okay. So self-derogation is definitely a problem. Now, here, this is where I think the data gets a little bit more complex. And again, this is monitoring the future data that we have essentially going back to the 1970s. And if we go back to 1977, right, what do we find? Well, it's basically liberal girls and conservative girls, again, are in roughly the same place in terms of thinking that whenever they try to get ahead, something or somebody stops me. They're in roughly the same place. Boys, liberal boys, were slightly less likely to think that, right? Okay, and it kind of bumps around, and this part of the graph, right, around here, this looks really normal. Lots of bumpiness, lots of bumps going on, up and down. And again, here we see a kind of sharp rise starting in about 2010, where liberal girls and conservative girls especially really split, right? You see a big split between liberal and conservative girls, where liberal girls seem to start thinking that something or someone is getting in the way, right? And it goes from being kind of roughly even, to about 20%, about a fifth, maybe a little bit more than a fifth of both of them. By the time we hit 2021, you're talking about a third of liberal girls, and then just about half of that, 15% of conservative girls who think that. Okay, I'll tell you. And for boys, it's a little bit more complex, right? These numbers kind of overlap. The most recent split makes it look like conservative boys now have higher scores of self-derogation, where again, it's almost 30% of them think every time they try to get ahead, something or someone gets in the way, and liberal boys kind of drops down below a fifth. So that is probably a more positive number. Okay, I think it's clear why self-derogation would matter. What is this? So this is what we would typically call, differences in locus of control, right? And you can have one of two types of locus of control, either, internal or external locus of control. Okay? Now, if you have an external locus of control, generally speaking, you think that forces outside of yourself control your life and you feel powerless. Powerlessness, not generally a particularly good thing, right? It can lead to things like anger, resentment, depression, or despair, right? So what do we see? The ones most likely to report external locuses of control are liberal girls and conservative boys, thinking that there are structural forces that stop them from advancing, right? Internal locuses of control, right? You think that you can do things to make your life better. You feel empowered. you feel agency in your own life, likely you're going to score less in terms of depression. So if I wanted to put on my tinfoil hat-ish, my tinfoil sociology hat, which is much better than just your standard tinfoil hat. One of the things that I think is likely is that one of the things that we see in terms of increasing sort of male resentment, we'll talk about the boy crisis in a second, but the growth of things like the manosphere, right? And male influencers that spread kind of relatively toxic messages to boys likely has something to do with a growing external locus of control amongst young men who feel like, and here probably conservative young men, who feel like, there's some kind of external force that is stopping them from getting ahead, right? And I think, if you've heard any of the manosphere influencers, people like, what's his name? Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate would be one. There's other ones, and I can't remember them off the top of my head. I can see his stupid face in my head. Whatever, it doesn't matter. They play on this external locus of control and people feeling like they don't have control in their lives to exploit them and give them really bad ideologies and blame things like women or feminism or all of these sorts of things. Okay. So, yeah, gaps growing too. I don't have Canada on here, which is unfortunate. This again is from FT, I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. What we see here, right? A widening ideological gap between men and women. Women in general becoming more liberal. I mean, if you're in South Korea, apparently men in South Korea are becoming way more conservative. In the US, right, women really since about 2010 have become considerably more kind of politically liberal, while men have stayed, I would say, I guess they've gotten a little bit more conservative. But only a little bit. Germany, same story. And then the UK, this looks like two snakes dancing. Right? Women have gotten considerably more liberal than men, although men have also gotten more liberal, just at a far slower pace. So there's an increasing gap I would say, values between men and women, which again, if you want to think about this in terms of, marriageability, these kinds of gaps matter because if you can't find someone who shares your values, typically pretty hard to get married, right? So amongst other things, it's probably exacerbating sort of declines in marriage. A gap in values between men and women is likely, one of the things. And largely this appears to be driven by men becoming slightly more conservative and women becoming much more liberal politically. Okay. Yeah, weird stuff. And I think, oh my gosh, I have more slides. Questions. Would you say you are able to predict and read and understand people better now as opposed to before teaching SOC? Oh, a few slides are missing on Canvas. I must have added a few last semester. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I will re-upload those slides later. I am bad sometimes. I add random charts because I like them. When I say I'm better able to predict and read and understand people, but no, if anything, I think I understand people worse. Honestly, if anything, I think sociology has generally taught me that people don't make sense. And if anything, it has suggested to me that expecting consistency out of people is a waste of time. And especially, this is when I look at the religion numbers, this class is not as bad. But when I look at my favorite one is when 33% of atheists say they believe in God, and I then just want to hit my head against the table and just be like, what do you mean by believe in God? And what do you mean by atheist? What are you? Please help, right? Or that, it's 25% of atheists say they pray sometimes. And I'm like, to what? I don't understand. What are you praying to? I don't know either. Anyway, this is a whole section of SOC of religion where I just stare at the charts and I'm like, Like, people don't make sense. And, if anything, sociology has taught me that people don't make sense. And the labels we try to put on people are always too restrictive. And people are way more interesting, weird, and inconsistent in their beliefs. So it gets really, really hard to actually categorize people. And it's super fun. But sometimes you just kind of have to throw your hands up and be like, I think the problem is people don't know how to categorize themselves, and that's the problem. So I'd actually say, yeah, I understand people. I understand more about the world, but I think I understand people worse than I did before, and I'm much more likely to just be like, I don't know. I don't think I can explain anything. Do stats for conservative boys and liberal girls hold true in the opposite for liberal boys and conservative girls? Stats for conservative. I'm not sure I understand that question. I mean, if you're talking about, if you're talking about sort of a locus of control, yeah. So conservative girls seem to have the stronger locus of control. Like, they feel like they're more in charge of their own lives, which again is good. They're less likely to blame external forces, and yeah, liberal boys a little bit less likely than conservative boys. So the gap there is not as big. I think that's what you're talking about. Okay. I'm sorry these charts are missing. They're fun. Good times. These are just kind of interest here. So half of 12th graders say it's very likely they'll get married, but you see the shift over time, right? People today, roughly, right? So if we go back to 1993, it was about 84% of young people who said that they were likely, what was it? If they did get married or are married, it's fairly likely they would stay married to the same person. I think the more interesting one here is want to have children, right? People in 1993, way more likely to say they would want to have children than people in 2023, right? So a decline in a desire to have children, which is really interesting and really kind of makes sense when you think about that sharp fertility decline that we've been seeing, right? Girls are now less likely to say they want to get married than boys, right? And again, if we go back to 1993, 83% of girls said they wanted to get married. That has now dropped to 61% of girls, right? So most likely to choose to get married in the long run, right? So that's a big decline in terms of girls' desire to get married. And boys, have stayed roughly the same, right? It's gone from 76 to 74. So boys haven't changed much in terms of their desire to get married. Girls want to get married way less than they wanted to in the past, which again, super kind of interesting. All right, and we saw this one already earlier in the course. Birth rates are dropping more for liberals than conservatives. So, eventually the conservatives, if conservatism is heritable, which I think it might be, right, you might inherit more conservative genes. Eventually the conservatives will just breed progressives out of existence. So there you go. Self-selection is powerful. Okay, social media, maybe it plays a role. My pen has died. Oh dear. Nothing can happen with the pen not working. No, I'm kidding. The pen doesn't work. Class dismissed. Okay, so my pen will now work again. It just needs to reconnect with my laptop. So, percentage of UK teens depressed as a function of social media. And again, what you see here, right, it looks like there seems to be some correlation between more hours spent on social media and higher rates of depression, right? So this is probably one of the big drivers. And we'll talk about this more, not in the next unit, but the unit after that, when we talk about youth and technology. Okay, am I out? I'm done. Yay, okay. Wow, I finished a whole unit today. I'm so good at my job. I kid. I'm bad at my job. Okay. Now, we'll start on, we got a few minutes left, 17 minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about boys. We're going to start talking about boys. We'll keep going next time, and I think this sets us up really well to finish everything in good order for the course with everything I promised to talk about and so much more. Okay, so we're going to talk about boys and men, right? what is happening with boys and men, because it is its own kind of strange and interesting story. Okay, so I'm going to take a whole bunch of stuff for this out of this particular book, right? This is Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeve. I could have taken it from a few other sources, right? There's Hannah Rosen's The End of Men. And there's another one. I can't remember the title of it off the top of my head. But there's an increasing kind of body of kind of scholarly and scholarly adjacent literature about what's going on with men and boys. And I think this is among the more accessible ones. This comes from Richard Reeve, right? Richard Reeves. He is a scholar at the Heritage Foundation in the U.S. And he, wrote this book a few years ago, and it made a fair splash, just talking about what is going on with boys, right? Now, historically, and this will surprise none of you, historically, males had a significant advantage in things like academic achievement and degree attainment worldwide, right? So if we go back even just a couple of decades, men were enrolled in university more, they got more university degrees than women did. This has largely reversed, and it's reversed pretty much globally in recent decades. Girls and women have now surpassed males in almost every educational metric globally, and that gap is widening, right? And it's in primary, secondary, and tertiary, right? So post-secondary levels of education. And nobody really knows why, right? No one really understands what is going on with boys and men, but we probably should figure it out, because if we're going to, if equality and equitable educational outcomes is good, and definitely, more men in education getting better jobs would be a good thing, certainly for things like fertility, marriageability, but also just for, people doing well in life, right, for human flourishing, that would probably be good. And we don't really know why it's happening. Okay, so, did I do an animation? Wow, I never do animations. Okay, so what has the shift been, right? Well, basically, if we go back those heady days of 1972 and compare it to 2019, right? So that's pre-pandemic. Basically, women surpassed men in earning a bachelor's degree, and this basically erased an earlier gap and actually has created a big gap in the opposite direction, right? So it's now not just equal. Women have actually, surpassed men substantially. So basically, the gap in terms of earning undergraduate degrees, bachelor's degrees, is now about 15% in favor of women. In 1972, 2072 is yet to come. We only know we'll probably be dead by then, thank God. I can't imagine the horrors that await us in 2072. Morlocks, zombies, aliens, who knows. 13% in favor of men in 1972, so men earned 13% more degrees. So basically, the trend has swung about 28% in the period from 1972 to 2019. And as we talked about when we were talking education, COVID seems to have tanked male enrollments in a lot of places, right? And basically what we saw, right, we said there was a 1.2 million decrease in enrollments. 1 million of those were male, right? Around the time COVID hit, right? So 1 million fewer men were attending U.S. colleges after COVID than before. It's about 200,000 women, right? So an 800,000 gap there. Okay. The underperformance of boys, and especially those from that lowest socioeconomic strata. So this affects, in the U.S., African American or Black males considerably more than other groups. Affects all sorts of things, their employment, their mobility, their likelihood of being incarcerated, right? All of these things increase the less education they have. How are we doing? Okay, 12 minutes or so. Okay, the case of Finland, right? So Reeves talks about Finland Now, Finland is an interesting case, right? If we go back to like the early days of the PISA study, right? So this is this educational test that they give out to high school students in OECD countries, right? So we talked about it earlier in the education unit. PISA is often held up as this kind of global gold standard for seeing how your education system is doing. Finland, for a long time did really well. In the last maybe 7 years, Finland's really tanked. It's seen like one of the biggest declines of any country, but that's, that's not the point of this. Sometimes people are like, Finland has a great education system. It used to. It's now actually not doing as well. But Finland has often been held up, as an education model for other nations, particularly for how highly educated Finnish teachers are. Every Finnish teacher has to have a master's in education. But yeah, Finnish students historically ranked pretty well in the PISA studies. And if we go back to those years that they ranked in the top, right, it was like Singapore, Hong Kong, Finland in the top of the rankings. And then it was like South Korea, Singapore, Finland after that. Finland ranked really well. But when they did, there was a massive gender gap. Basically, the Finnish score was largely driven by the extremely high achievements of Finnish girls, right? 20% of Finnish girls were scoring at the highest levels readings. It's only 9% of Finnish boys. And actually, Finnish and American boys scored about equally in terms of reading. Now, I've been to Finland. How anyone can read Finnish, I will never know. There is no language with more vowels per word than Finnish, I'm convinced. Love Finland. Beautiful country, lovely people. Thank God everyone there under the age of like 45 speaks English fluently, because if I had to learn how to speak Finnish, I wouldn't have gotten very far. Like I said, awesome country, love Finland, but the language is completely insane. Wonderful, I'm sure, if you speak it, but apparently it's basically impossible for English language speakers to learn. Okay, so Finnish and American boys score about the same in reading. And yeah, mostly true for measures of math and science as well. The really high Finnish scores are driven by girls, right? So, high PISA scores for Finland, largely a result of really smart and really accomplished Finnish girls. And in general, if we look across the OECD, right, so the most developed economies in the world, girls are about a year ahead of boys in terms of reading ability pretty consistently. And boys, where they used to hold a big advantage in math, are now barely ahead, right? So this thing that boys tend to dominate math, that was true, it's now less likely. Okay, and boys are 50% more likely to fail in all three key areas of school compared to girls, right? So math, science, and reading, boys are less likely to succeed than girls. Okay, love this chart. This chart, if you want to see male struggles in one chart, this is pretty much it. Okay, so girls, 14% more likely to be school ready than boys at age 5, right? And that's usually the age, right, that we put children in kindergarten, right? So we usually put children in kindergarten at about age 5, sometimes a little bit before. Some people, depending on their birth, they might go in at 4 and turn 5 in kindergarten. But girls are more likely to flourish in this kind of scenario. There's a 6-point gender gap in reading proficiency in 4th grade, and that widens to an 11-point gap by 8th grade. So girls read better than boys pretty consistently. In math, 6-point gap favoring boys in 4th grade has shrunk to 1 point by 8th grade. Most common high school grade for girls is now an A. For boys, it's a B, right? Now this chart, if you want to see male struggles in a chart, this is basically it, right? So at the bottom of this chart, or at this end, on the left side of this chart, that is the percentage. So basically, if you split it male and female, this is students who earn the lowest grades. So about 2/3 of the students earning the lowest grades are male, and about 1/3 are female. At the other end, in terms of people earning the highest grades, about 2/3 of those earning highest grades are female, and only about 1/3 of them are male, right? So males, and it kind of evens out in the middle here in terms of our kind of median grades. Looking at our C range, C, B minus, it's about 50-50. There's not a huge difference between male and female. Obviously, the people in this top third, right, or even the top quartile, that's where people get really great access to better college and university programs, right? Their averages are higher. So in general, girls are going to have better access to the best colleges, best college programs than males are, right? And males are more likely to be kind of really struggling in school. They're more likely to be earning lower grades. Okay. Do men typically complete more vocational education compared to women? Does that explain some of the discrepancies? So, some, but not all, right? You have many more men. Hang on. Okay, so a couple of things that are important there. Yes, men do dominate the trades, right? So vocational school, all of those things. That said, when you talk about those blue collar kinds of jobs, one of the really important things to remember, maybe I'll go back one slide, is that basically, in terms of purchasing power of those wages have basically been stagnant since about 1976, right? Where compared to those who have a four-year college degree, they've been upwardly mobile, earning more and having more spending power since roughly the same period, right? So blue collar trades, they're perfectly fine and you can do fairly well, but the earning power of a lot of them have stagnated pretty radically. They haven't grown certainly as much as college educated people, right? So that does explain some of it, but there's also just a lot of men that aren't earning any kind of post-secondary education whatsoever. Okay. And I mean, if being kind of blue-collar working class was the solution, I'm actually all for it. But it seems that just a lot more men are not getting into that percentage, right? And if you think about it, what did we talk about earlier in the course? I'm sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. And maybe I'll stop after this and we'll pick it up from here. What was it, right? Was it 40%? That was Melissa Kearney's number, right? Of children in the US are born to men that bring no positive resources to the relationship. So there's a lot of men that seem like underemployed, no employment, struggling, that generally would probably do better if they were getting some kind of post-secondary education that would give them better job prospects. Okay, do those two go together? No, let's start with graduation next time. We got 3 minutes, and I don't want to do any more. So, no, I do, but I'm out of time, and I hate pushing and trying to finish everything on a slide in no time. So let's stop here. We'll pick this up on Monday. So Monday we'll finish this unit, and we'll go from there into youth and technology, depending on how this goes. We might have time for something different. Okay, we'll see you next week. Oh, I don't want subtitles now. This one. Yeah, not too many slides left. We're in good shape. All right, see you next week.